It's great to welcome to the program today Cal Newport, who is a computer science professor at Georgetown University, also author of several books, including most recently Digital Minimalism, Choosing a Focused Life in a Noisy World, previously Deep Work, which I recently recommended to my audience. Cal, it's so great to have you on. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
So, I've been following with great interest the sort of societal and cultural impact of modern media, social media, technology that includes smartphones and Netflix and all sorts of sort of on-demand entertainment. And you've also been writing extensively about this for a long time. I don't think it'll come as a shock to my audience that I agree with a lot of your conclusions, many of which we'll talk about momentarily. But when did you first sort of get tipped off to the idea that there is something going on here that is impacting how people sort of go about their days and get work done or don't get work done or relate to other people in the world? Like, how early on did you pick up on this issue?
Well, back in 2012, I had published a career advice book called So Good They Can't Ignore You. And one of the ideas in that book is that getting really good at rare and valuable skills was a huge piece of leverage in crafting a career that was really meaningful. So after that book came out, my readers were asking me, okay, well, how do I do that? How do I become really good at things that are rare and valuable? And as I started looking into that question, I started coming up with this tension. I would find something that's important, such as concentration, learning new skills, producing at a high level. And every time I come up with something important, I would find this technological foil that was unintentionally making it harder to do that. And so my 2016 book, Deep Work, was really about this tension between how concentrating is becoming more important in our economy at the same time that technology in the workplace was making us worse at concentrating. And so that book came out, and then my readers pushed back again and said, yeah, but what about life outside of work? We're feeling like technology, especially what's happening on our smartphones, is taking us away or reducing the quality of what we're trying to do with our life outside of the professional context. So again, that pushed me into that topic for digital minimalism. And so this has been the story of my writing life, let's say over the last 7 years or so, is keep coming up against these tensions between humans striving to flourish and unintentional consequences of technology that are holding them back from it.
So let's focus in a little bit first on the deep work component, and then in part two, we'll dig in more deeply into what you outline in digital minimalism. I thought before I read your books that I was handling a lot of these issues really pretty well. I was sort of like satisfied with what I felt was my work-life balance, my relationship to technology, the amount of time I was spending on sort of what I would consider to be like the core important tasks for what I do, which are researching the stories that make it onto my show, preparing and actually filming the show. And when I read Deep Work, I realized a huge percentage of what I'm doing is this so-called shallow work, which is everything from responding to emails, dealing with administrative tasks, and sort of all of those things that aren't really the core of what it is that I'm doing. For people who are not aware of what you're arguing, what percentage of many jobs now is consumed not by sort of like the core deep work, but by this shallow work that you identify as not sort of core to what one is trying to achieve to produce value?
I think for many knowledge work positions these days, accidentally, we've gotten to a place where the vast majority of people's time is being spent either on non-deep activities or being done somehow roughly in parallel with deep activities, greatly reducing their efficacy. In other words, I think we're doing a really poor job right now allocating cognitive resources. In an elite knowledge economy like we have in the US, the number one capital resource is attention capital, the ability of human brains, the human brains that you employ to actually concentrate and produce information with new value. And we're doing a terrible job right now at getting the best return on that capital investment. And so even just having this terminology, there's a difference between deep work, where you're trying to actually extract maximum value from the brain, versus shallow work, which is how you keep the lights on and the trains running on time. Just understand there's a difference between those two, allows you to have these type of realizations that, wait a second, we're paying all of this money to house all of these brains and to put them in nice offices and air condition them and heat them and give them benefits so that the brains can be healthy and produce value. And yet we're then allowing these brains to spend the vast majority of their time doing sort of non-high level, non-skilled sort of administrative style work.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I'm realizing that a lot of this time you're doing all of that stuff to sit around and effectively answer emails and be a go-between between other individuals. So at the very top level, obviously we can't go through everything in an interview like this, but one of the things you talk about is very clearly delineating when it is that you were doing that shallow work. In a lot of professions, you can't get rid of it altogether, but it seems that condensing it and compartmentalizing it into particularly planned and scheduled times is sort of one idea that can be effective for a lot of people. From a very practical standpoint, is that doable for people in most professions? I feel like that's one of the most common things people say when I tell them I'm trying to do this. They say, sounds great if you can do it, but here's why it would not apply to my particular profession, which I'm guessing you hear often.
I hear it a lot. And there certainly are professions in which, let's say, concentrated cognitive work, what I call deep work, is not that important. But I also think that people vastly overestimate the number of professions for which that's actually true. And what I recommend is that people should have clarity. This is how much deep work I'm doing. This is how much non-deep or shallow work I'm doing. And they should have some sense of, for my position, what is the optimal ratio? In a normal week, what is the optimal ratio of deep work hours to shallow work hours from the perspective of what optimizes the value I produce for the organization? I think people should have an answer to this question. I think people should be discussing this question with their supervisors or bosses if they work for someone else. I think people should be measuring and seeing how well they're coming up against this ratio. Now, the ratio is going to be different for different people. It's going to be different for different jobs. Some jobs, let's say you're a novelist, probably the ratio should be almost 100% deep work. And in other jobs, let's say you're a lobbyist here in DC where I am, well, maybe almost all of what you're doing is just connecting to people and there's very little deep work. But you should have an answer. We can't blind ourselves to how much deep work we're doing versus how much shallow and what would be better. And the feedback I'm getting from my readers is that once you get quantitative on this is the ratio that makes sense for my job. Here's where I am. There's a gap. Once you're quantitative on this, you see the stark numbers. This sparks a lot more cultural changes than people assume is possible.
Now, a lot of this also depends for people who are not in a sort of supervisor, business owner, or entrepreneur role, but rather are working for somebody else. A big part of this is, as you mentioned, having these conversations with whoever is kind of monitoring your time, because the expectations from sort of modern employers often would create a problem for a lot of people if they were saying, hey, half the day I'm going to try to do 3 hours, for example, or 4 hours, which you've suggested, if I recall correctly, maybe sort of the max for this deep work that someone may be able to get done in a normal day. A lot of this has to do with the culture in which people are working, does it not?
It does, but we think that these cultures are entrenched and are immutable. But the reality is often that they're arbitrary and emergent and are much more malleable than we think once we actually come at them precisely. So here's a classic story that I heard after my book came out. Was someone who was in marketing for a Silicon Valley firm. So he wrote white papers, which are incredibly complex and really benefit from deep work. And so he went to his CEO and said, okay, here's what deep work is. Here's what shallow work is. What ratio of deep to shallow work makes the most sense for my job? Now, he clarified before he did this, he was very nervous because this organization had a Slack culture in which if you did not respond to Slack right away, you were seen as ironically slacking off. But he had this conversation with his CEO, and he said it became almost immediately clear that it would be crazy for the answer to be 0. They decided that 50-50 made sense, and it took about a week for them to change this. He just told his team, these 2 hours in the morning, these 2 hours in the afternoon, that's when he is doing his deep work. He's not to be interrupted. Don't expect a response. It took people about a week to get used to it. And now suddenly, this guy has a 50-50 deep to shallow ratio with complete buy-in from his team and the CEO. And it took him only, let's say, a week to actually change. Where before he had this conversation, he was convinced this is a Slack place. This is a Slack office. If you're not responding, it'll never work. So I think we think these cultures are there for a reason and they're entrenched and our bosses are going to insist on them. You push a little deeper and you realize often nobody is happy with them, and a great change is possible as long as you're clear, positive, and quantitative about why you're making the change.
Yeah, after reading Deep Work and a bunch of articles about Slack, I immediately canceled Slack fully and told all of my employees we're simply not using it. And in fact, I went further. I said, hey, I'm really going to be trying to spend most of the morning on what I think is the most important thing, which is really researching and preparing for the show. So I will check my email when I get to my desk. and I will not look at email again for several hours. If there's a real emergency, text me. I'm not going to ignore you, right? I mean, these are employees, and to some degree, I need to be available. But if it's not an emergency, you're not going to hear back from me. And very quickly, everybody just does seem to adjust. So a lot of it is, as you're saying, what you think is necessary versus what is sort of actually necessary in many cases. And along those same lines, I'm curious, is there a way, or do you have any anecdotes about how we can quantify the effect of these longer periods of concentration on productivity? Because I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that one gets more done by switching between tasks and sort of covering a lot of basis in a less deep way. But qualitatively and quantitatively, it actually seems counter to the reality. How can we sort of explain how the focus for longer periods of time quantitatively actually allows people to get more done?
Well, I think a mindset shift that helps here is thinking about efforts in terms of, let's say, learn, skilled, applied. So if you're answering emails or jumping on calls or moving things back and forth in PowerPoint, these are all activities that don't actually require the application of sort of hard won or elite level skills. And so the value they're producing is not actually that high as compared to, let's say, you're thinking very deeply on researching a piece you're going to do for your show, something that you're uniquely qualified to do that builds on a large foundation of experience that requires a lot of concentration. That is going to produce much more value because that's much more rare or hard to do. And so I have this trick in the book where I talk about quantify the activity you're about to do with how many hours would it take to train a smart recent college grad to do what you're about to do. And if the answer is I could probably train them in a few hours to do this, then that's probably not an activity that's going to be massively value producing. But if on the other hand, it probably would take them 4 or 5 years of training and work and experience before they could even approximate what I'm about to be doing, you're getting a much higher return on the cognitive resource for that activity. And so I think this mindset shift is crucial. Shallow work is necessary to keep things running, but it doesn't produce a ton of value. Deep work is the actual, the wrench is on the car, building the thing that's going to go off the assembly line and be sold type activities. And once you have that mindset shift, you begin to worry about shallow work and how much time your employees are spending on it, and really start to focus on the deep work because that's what produces the value.
So in part 2, we'll dig in much more deeply to digital minimalism, which is the latest book. But to start getting us in that mindset and transitioning into that, can you talk a little bit about what sort of psychological problems or emotional sort of issues can arise when we become attached to this type of, quote, multitasking, which I know you and I actually take issue with the idea that it's actually multitasking rather than switching between things really quickly. What are the issues that can develop longer term in terms of concentration, in terms of emotional issues as well?
Well, there's a few issues. One is context switching. So switching to an inbox and then back to a primary task reduces your cognitive capacity. And that effect takes a while to clear out. And so if you are constantly having to jump over and check an inbox or a Slack channel, then return to what you're doing, you're not really single tasking. This context switching is having a huge psychological burden on what you're actually able to produce. And so it's like buying a fancy piece of equipment in a factory, but then allowing sand to build up in its gears so it can't function as hard. It's a real crisis. I don't think we understand it. There's also a social drag on a workplace that's built on constant ongoing conversation. Our brains are sophisticated social computers that evolved in a context where we didn't have digital inboxes. And so you might know rationally that those 600 unread emails in your inbox are different than, let's say, a member of your tribe sitting across from the fire trying to get your attention. But there's a deep part of your brain that doesn't see that distinction. And it sees it as social obligations that you are ignoring, which is, according to your brain, a crisis. And so that makes us anxious and uneasy about all this, the communication that we're not answering. It makes us check things more compulsively. And then finally, we have a long-term ability and our ability, degradation, our ability to concentrate. If your brain gets used to constantly switching between different stimuli, when it comes time to really lock in and use those neurons to produce information that's valuable for you and your organization, you're going to be worse at it. Just like if you're a professional athlete and you're smoking outside of the games and your training, it's going to have an effect on the field. Same thing. If your whole life is constantly moving back and forth between professional and personal inboxes and screens and apps, your brain is going to get worse and worse at actually locking in and producing new and valuable information.
That's actually a great place to pause our conversation with Cal Newport. We've been talking about two of his books, Digital Minimalism as well as Deep Work, which is now 3 years old. We will continue the conversation with him on tomorrow's program and dig further into Digital Minimalism, the latest book. We're continuing our conversation today with Cal Newport, who is a computer science professor at Georgetown University, also author of several books, including the brand new Digital Minimalism, Choosing a Focused Life in a Noisy World. Cal, I've already adopted a lot of the techniques that you talk about in the book. And not only did I tell my staff that I was doing this, I actually told my audience as well. I told my audience I am significantly going to be limiting my engagement on Twitter, partially because when you do political stuff, it's extraordinarily toxic and mostly negative, anti-Semitic comments in my particular case. But for anybody, I would argue what you were talking about in digital minimalism would really serve both attention spans as well as just sort of general emotional health. So let's start there. What is the most important way that we should understand the effect of this endless scrolling, what I call the operant conditioning variable rewards mechanism that social media has? Why is that bad for us?
Well, there's a couple things going on. One is these apps have been engineered to foster compulsive use. And so what happens is at first it becomes an easy distraction. And then over time, it becomes a replacement for other activities that are more meaningful and more satisfying. And therefore, more and more of your discretionary time gets funneled into what are essentially these virtual data factories where you sit here scrolling, helping the revenue numbers of three or four companies, while other parts of your life that are more important and more meaningful get neglected. And then there's the actual content and engagement when you're actually looking at these screens. Some of what you do on these screens is fine. It's good for you. I mean, there's nothing specifically negative about, let's say, sending a comment to a relative of yours about what they're up to. But because the algorithms behind a lot of these new news feeds or Twitter feeds are optimized for engagement, there's this sort of darker side of what you're actually looking at, where just like you talked about with your experience in Twitter, that it pulls you towards extremism, it pulls you towards darkness, it pulls you towards a place of feeling socially uneasy or unhappy, which eventually makes these things, I like to think of them as unhappiness generating machines.
There are people who will put in place sort of protocol like a weekly digital Sabbath. On Saturday, I don't touch any of my technology and or I don't look at any social networks. Or when I'm on vacation, I will get completely off of them or whatever the case may be. The problem I have with that, or the concern I have, is that it's sometimes used to justify really unhealthy social media behaviors all of the other time, because you're saying, hey, listen, Saturdays I'm doing the thing that I think is better for me, or once a year I'm doing this other thing. How important are these sort of every once in a while cleanses, so to speak, versus just kind of like maintaining healthy habits throughout the year?
I think they're a terrible idea. I mean, if you want my opinion, if I had a friend, let's say, who during the week was abusing alcohol and was causing lots of negative impacts in their life, if they came to me and said, "Don't worry, I have this great plan. I'm not going to drink on Saturdays," I would say, I think you're missing the bigger problem here. The fact that you have something that's such a negative force in your life that you feel the need to schedule escapes from is perhaps evidence that this is a problem that needs a more systematic solution, which is why in my book, I talk about a digital declutter as opposed to a digital detox. I think people in the substance abuse community, for example, are really upset about the way that the word detox has been co-opted into this digital world to mean something that's really different than the original meaning, which is just let's take a break from something that's giving us trouble. I talk in terms of decluttering, because when you're decluttering, you're not taking a break from all of the extra stuff you have in your house. You're getting rid of it. And I think that's what we really need.
The idea of turning off notifications from apps. I mean, does that even register as a significant change that people can make, or is it just not nearly anything?
Basically, what I discovered is these smaller hacks like notifications, making your screen grayscale, moving where your apps are into folders on the second screen of your iPhone, or these digital wellness tools where you see like a tree that's dying or something every time you pick up your phone, they're not cutting it. I think the cultural and technological forces that are drawing people back to their screen too much and making them unhappy are way too strong to throw assorted hacks and tricks at it. And this has been my observation. We've tried this for about 5 or 6 years now, and it's really not working.
There are studies that claim to be able to assess the sort of degree of negative or positive impact of different online platforms. There's one that's been talked about quite a bit, which says of all the online platforms that were looked at, YouTube was the only one that seemed to have like a net benefit for people in terms of well-being, and that every other one, with Instagram being the absolute and total worst, have a net negative impact on people's emotions and psyche, et cetera. What's your sense of sort of looking at the nitty gritty of these individual platforms, or do you think that that kind of misses the boat?
I don't think it does. And so if you take a minimalist approach to these technologies, which is what I suggest, it says you start with identifying what really matters to you, what you want to spend your time on, what you value. And then you work backwards and say, is there some way to deploy technology that's going to give me a big win on one of these particular values? And then you ignore everything else. And so depending on what those values are, there may be a very specific technology, maybe even a technology that makes some people really unhappy that works for you. So a common example I came across, for example, were visual artists. It turns out if you're a visual artist, what you need, the main fuel for your work is creative input. You have to see other work from other artists in a similar type of genre, and Instagram has been great for this. So now for the first time, if you're a visual artist, you can look at other artists' works remotely without having to live in one or two cities that happens to have a major gallery scene. So it's been a powerful democratizing force. So if you're a visual artist, the careful use of Instagram, let's say every week expose yourself to a carefully curated list of artists, is very positive. On the other hand, if you're, say 22-year-old college grad, kind of unhappy and adrift, Instagram could be a massive source of negative energy and distraction. And so I don't like to think about good technologies and bad technologies. I like to think about good uses of your time, good values, and bad, and putting the technology to work for the former.
Along those lines, you talk in both digital minimalism and deep work, I think, although I'm going sort of from memory here, about the power of sometimes just saying no. And you describe something that I encounter a lot, which is I'll get a request in my email. And I really do think of every email I get as a request on my time, right? That's the sort of starting point. Requests where, hey, David, would you be willing to participate in some kind of a 6-person panel or whatever? And really, the answer is just like no. The correct answer is no. The right answer, given where I am at any particular point in time in my career and personal life, is no. But through some combination of like guilt and maybe the fear of missing out, I'll sort of say no, but also say, but what I can do is give you some ideas for good questions for the panel, for example. And what I'm effectively doing is volunteering myself to do something where I'm losing all of the possible benefit of being involved, but still committing some of my time. Talk a little bit about the hesitancy that society has bred into us to be afraid or hesitant to just say no when a straight no is really kind of the right answer for us.
Well, part of this is an unintentional consequence of introducing low friction digital communication into the world. A lot of our issues with technology in general are unintentional because we take things that have been evolved into us in another context and then we introduce these new tools. And so in a tribal context, if it's here's my tribe and there's 10 of us, we're wired to be very wary of social reciprocity. If someone else in the tribe says, hey, can you help me, whatever, carry my spears over to where we're hunting the mastodon, you're probably gonna say, I probably should do that if I can, just like you would if a family member wanted your help in the morning to, with something that's going on. Because in small tribal context, social reciprocity is important for knitting together the social fabric. Now, when you introduce into the picture the sort of universal low friction digital communication like email, which means sort of anyone in the country can now send you a message and try to request some of your time and attention. We still have that same instinct to do social reciprocity, but it doesn't scale because now there's hundreds of thousands of people now in this tribe who could be making these requests. And so what we really have is this collision on our Paleolithic social instincts versus our technological digital world, and they're clashing. And these clashes cause a lot of the problems we have. And when it comes to this particular issue, we do want to help because that is our instinct. But once we get rid of this friction, probably the right framework is Kant's categorical imperative, right? The way that he tried to build up morality from scratch. He said the real question was, what happens if I take this specific case and I scale it out to a universal rule? Is that tractable? And once you start thinking that way, you see the problems with, let's say, saying yes to someone who has a request for you to be on a panel or do a 20-minute phone call. That request itself is perhaps small, but if you scale up to the general question of what would happen if I said yes to all of those, you would have no time left. And so we have to basically build a new philosophy from scratch, like Kant was trying to do in the 19th century, just to deal with this new social reality.
Yeah, and well, you actually take it even further in some cases, which is straight up don't respond to email. And you talk about situations in which there may be some short-term negative impact, maybe somebody thinks less of you if you ignore their email, but that it's important in a sense to set expectations based on what is scalable. And that it's okay in a sense to choose that there are swaths of types of emails that you simply shouldn't respond to. But the obvious question when people hear us talk about that will be, will that not bring negative repercussions over the long term? You argue that it really won't.
Well, what I've discovered is expectations tend to trump accessibility, and we don't always realize this. And so as an author, for example, if you go to my author website and go to the contact page, I don't have a general use email address. I have some specific email addresses for particular purposes, and I have what I call a sender filter with each, which is just a little bit of text that says, here's what this message is for, and here's what you should expect. And that text says for basically all of these, don't expect a response. Now, my worry was, okay, maybe this is going to upset people because I'm no longer as accessible. But it turns out that it doesn't, because what people care about more is expectations. So they're not expecting a response, and so they're not that upset when they don't get one. And the converse of that is when I do respond to someone, it seems like it's an unusually positive event. And so I think we overvalue accessibility and undervalue what people really want is some sort of expectations, some sort of consistency about, should I expect a response or not? Are you going to read this? Are you not? Should I even send this in the first place? So we need to do more work, I think, putting guards, filters, and information around our communication channels and get away from the sort of incredibly low friction, just anyone can reach me at any time about anything type of world, which causes all this confusion.
So to kind of wind down our conversation with what maybe is one of the bigger meta questions about all of this material, if indeed technology continues going in the same direction that it has been, if there's more sort of integration between the human body and a lot of these technologies, as some futurists, although not all, but believe there will be, will the type of approach that you're suggesting be practical if someone wants to live, I guess, what we would call like a normal person? And I know that that's an extremely stigmatizing and heavy sort of loaded term, but I think for our purposes, you sort of know what I mean. Will all of this become impossible if technology continues going in the direction it's been going?
Well, my personal sort of futurist hypothesis is that we're going to see the opposite trend happening. I think one of the biggest impact applications that we're going to see of artificial intelligence that we're not really talking that much about is that it's going to offload quite a bit of the sort of shallow administrative communication type stuff that takes up so much of our, especially professional lives. The model that a lot of large AI players are thinking about is really the chief of staff model, where I have a chief of staff, my sort of Leo McGarry to my Jed Bartlett from the West Wing, like a presidential chief of staff. You have one, everyone has one, but it's implemented by AIs. Those AIs are talking to each other, preserving us to use our brains more focused on the things that our brains do well. Sort of, here's what you should be working on right now. All the information is here. Think hard about it, provide something good. The AI will take care of it. And so I think we're actually going to see in the future a significant decrease in the amount of time we spend, let's say, doing shallow communication back and forth, and a significant increase in the time we spend actually thinking hard, because from an economic point of view, that is just a much, much larger return on the capital investment in human brains. If you can get human brains spending most of their time thinking hard about things that only human brains can do, minimize the context switching, minimize the time lost to having to answer emails from HR or setting up meetings or sending back and forth Google invites, you take that all off the plate, you're going to get a huge increase in the amount of value that you get out of this particular capital investment. And so I see a future where, let's say, email or Slack are going to be seen as relatively primitive tools that we had to deal with while waiting for our tech to get where it really needs to get to support a thriving knowledge economy.
Well, that is a nice optimistic note. I feel like to end what often are sort of dystopian feeling conversations. We've been speaking with Cal Newport, who's a computer science professor at Georgetown University. Make sure to check out his latest book, Digital Minimalism: Choosing a Focused Life in a Noisy World. Cal, really appreciate your time today.
My pleasure.